Now let's talk about cleavage. Yay. A social cleavage is an internal division, something that divides people, divides society, and it may be based on differences, because that's typically what divides people, like religion, ethnicity, social class, and territories. Like if you live in a rural or an urban area, or do you live in the north or the south, or the coast or the inland? Do you live on the outskirts of town or inland? These are all factors that can divide individuals and groups of people. Social cleavages are a division among identity-based groups that are relevant to political participation. So what this means is that social cleavages impact politics. They impact candidates and how people vote and who people vote for. People in urban areas typically vote for policies that increase economic development and increase urbanization. People in rural areas typically don't. Let's look at cleavages across our country. So starting with China. Ethnic and regional differences between the majority Han ethnic group, that's the majority group in China, and at least 55 recognized ethnic minorities like the Uyghurs in the northwest and the Tibetans in the southwest do exist. So we see a lot of ethnic cleavages. We see cleavages between at regions. So we see rural versus urban, which is west to east. The west is more rural. The east is more urban towards the coast, because that's where cities are typically located, because you can import and export goods. Eastern coastal provinces, like cities like Shanghai, which is shown in the picture here, have experienced rapid industrialization and economic development. They are way richer than the rural areas. There are hubs for innovation and wealth and business and trade. We also see political cleavages, particularly in economic cleavages that exist between the wealthy communist elites and the business owners, as well as between the peasants and the poor and the overall just daily masses and average citizens within the country. So we can see a variety of different economic cleavages within China. Let's look at Iran now. So within Islam, there are divisions between the Shia majority and those who are Sunni. And these are just different branches of Islam. Like in Christianity, we have different denominations. Islam also has different branches. So Shia Islam is the official state religion of Iran. There is a minority Sunni Islam population. While both Shia and Sunni Muslims coexist, there are high tensions between the two communities, and that's existed for hundreds of years. I'm thinking of the Ottoman Empire, but now it's in Iran. It's in areas where Sunni populations are concentrated, are along the border with Sunni majority countries like Pakistan and Afghanistan. Religious differences between the Shia Muslim majority also occur between other religions, not just Islam, like Christianity and Judaism. We see ethnic cleavages between the majority Persians and several ethnic minorities, like the Kurds. The Kurds are found in 4 different countries in the Middle East. They don't have their own state. We also see protests and unrest in regions with significant ethnic minority populations. So they've taken notice, I guess, to the elephant in the room. Especially the Kurds. They want greater autonomy. They want greater protections and freedoms. They want to have a say-so in politics. We also see generational cleavages, where we see younger people support more secular and democratic change. They're more progressive, while older groups tend to be more conservative and religiously fundamentalists. Let's look at Mexico now. We see regional cleavages like in China between urban and rural areas. This time, the urban areas are concentrated towards the north, where industrialization takes place the closer you get to the United States. The south is more agricultural. Rural areas comprise of marginalized regions and may lack basic services. They have land disputes and often economic opportunities that are limited, or just don't exist at all. There's not really a lot of major cities in the south compared to the north. Agriculture is the significant source of livelihood and income for many, many rural Mexicans, and productivity is often constrained by factors such as who owns the land and how can they get access to technology as well as funds. We see ethnic divisions between the Amerindian, which is the indigenous populations, as well as the white people who live in Mexico, and the mestizos. Indigenous populations that live in Mexico, like the Mayans, often face social and economic marginalization and have relatively limited access to education and healthcare. Now, it's important to note that these individuals typically live in the South. They don't typically live where these urban, industrial, flourishing areas are located. And typically they're in their own communities with other members of their indigenous populations. They're not as mixed and diverse as the North is. Many indigenous communities, like I said, are in these remote areas, and they're very isolated, but also can be very vulnerable as a result. Let's look at Nigeria. So we see a lot of ethnic divisions because we know that Nigeria has a lot of ethnic groups. They have over 250 of them. We see religious cleavages as well. The north region of Nigeria is more Muslim. The south is predominantly more Christian. And federalism that was installed with the 1999 Constitution has created a strong central government that distributes power to the diverse states. And it's allowed Sharia law to dominate the northern states and influence its policy. And that's not to say that Christianity hasn't influenced the politics in the South either. We also see economic divisions between rural and urban. So the north is more rural, the south is more urban, and if you get a hint from that, the south is where the coast is, the north is where the inland area is. Kind of similar to the divisions in China. Economic prosperity with the country's oil industry is mostly located in the wealthier south, and the agriculture north is typically less profitable, less affluent, and just less economically prosperous. The oil industry in the South is, yes, a primary sector economic activity, but in the South we see a lot of major cities, like the capital city. So there's other factors influencing the economic prosperity in the South. In Russia, we see cleavages, ethnic cleavages between the Russians, who are typically Russian Orthodox, and other ethno-religious minorities. So we can see also a religious cleavage here, because these minorities are typically not Russian Orthodox. Russia is home to a variety of different minorities, like the Tatars, and the Chechens, and other different groups. They have different cultures and that comprise of different traditions and languages and religions that are different to ethnic Russians. We see a political economic cleavage between the elite oligarch class and the masses, the ordinary citizens. This elite oligarch class has a lot of political influence. They have a lot of power, especially in the economic sector of the country. They're the top business owners, the CEOs. They may even have seats in government, and they control the key industries that are used throughout the country, like the energies, resources, as well as the media and finance. They have close ties with the government and may influence policy decisions to serve their own interests, to make them richer, or give them more power, or to expand their influence, that sort of thing. It's important to note that the main point of a business is to grow and to make more money, and sometimes that can get out of hand. Let's look at the UK, though. So we do see cleavages in the UK. The main one that comes to my mind always is the ethnic and regional cleavages between the four main nations, the Scottish, the English, the Welsh, and the Irish. Each have their own culture and history, as well as their own, nowadays, political institutions, because we see a lot of devolution. We see religious differences between the Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland, and these religious differences actually cause Northern Ireland and the country of Ireland to separate recently. So Northern Ireland has a long history of tension between Protestant and Catholics, and this religious divide has had lots of historical context within disputes for land, who gets what land, identity, what does the country identify as, and who gets political power. There was a period known as the Troubles with an ethno-nationalist conflict. It began in the late 1960s and didn't end until the late 1990s. It was a 30-year period. And it saw a lot of violence and unrest between the Protestant Unionists, who wanted Northern Ireland to remain part of the UK, and Catholic nationalists, who sought to reunify with Ireland, to make that whole island one country. If you haven't figured out the differences yet, Northern Ireland is more Protestant, and Ireland, the country of Ireland, is more Catholic. The Good Friday Agreement was reached in 1998, and it brought relatively peace to Northern Ireland. And it stopped the lot of violence, but there's still divisions that occur, but especially between the religious groups, and this still influences politics and communities and social dynamics in the country. In the UK, we see class cleavages that often overlap with access to higher education and wealth. Access to higher education and wealth often correlate, yes, with your class background, with disparities in opportunities and outcomes. But this occurs in every country. The UK is not the only country with this. I'm just using this as an example, y'all. We also see tensions between whites and non-European minorities whose heritage is related to the UK's colonial history, such as those from India and Pakistan who have some kind of relationship to the UK, whether they're moving there or they're having economic relations with the country. Let's talk about voting behavior a little bit, because cleavages can affect voting behavior differently across our course countries. They can also impact our party systems and informal political networks and overall electoral processes. In Nigeria, in urban areas, we see prominent economic opportunities and abundant traffic. Voters may prioritize issues to get rid of this traffic, to invest in urban infrastructure, or to influence increased job creation. In Mexico, we see ethnic and regional differences that influence voting behavior, with the South often favoring more leftist candidates, while the North typically leans to more conservative options. In Iran, we see religious differences actually influencing voting behavior. Reformists, which are typically younger people, attract support from urban areas, and these are typically more educated populations, while more conservative individuals are older and typically live in more rural areas. In the UK, we see informal political networks that form around regional identity. Do you live in Scotland or Northern Ireland or Wales or England? Some of these groups seek autonomy, especially in Scotland, and divisions shape the structure of the party system. We see the Scottish nationalist parties. It's just all going back to Scotland. And these parties often have distinct bases of support in different parts of the UK because they're regional-based political parties. Let's look at the impacts of social cleavages now. So we can see separatist movements that it can occur. These have occurred in, so many different countries as a result of social cleavages. And these have always been a thing and they'll never go away. Other groups demand autonomy but not independence, so they're not considered separatist movements. Separatist movements is when a group of people like the Kurds in Iran want their own country. Ethnicity plays a big role in Nigeria and over any of our other countries, particularly Mexico, because of the different colonial histories and greater diversity and ethnic, religious identities and divisions within Nigeria. Remember, Nigeria has over 250 ethnic groups within the country. That's a lot of divisions, that's a lot of cultures, that's a lot of differences, and a lot of beliefs. Now, what responses have occurred to cleavages by people and by the governments? Because clearly they have some kind of impact here. In Nigeria, we see cleavages prompting government institutions to create election rules that encourage diverse representation between the 250 plus ethnic groups. This has strengthened political unity and legitimacy because it sees that the government's taking action here to address the issues, and people like that. So that's going to create legitimacy. It all comes down to legitimacy, always. In the UK, the regional cleavages have motivated referendums to devolve government powers to Scottish and Welsh regional assemblies. They have their own micro legislators, essentially, that they're still overseen by the federal legislator. But the Scottish and Welsh assemblies do have the power to pass legislation in just Scotland or just Wales. And this has increased the legitimacy of the UK state as a whole because it makes the Scottish and Welsh people believe that their needs are being met. In Russia, we see a cleavage between Russia and the Chechen people, and that's united Russians and fueled nationalist rhetoric and strengthened legitimacy of the state through Russians. Chechens don't see legitimacy because they don't see their needs being met. They're seeing the Russians coming together and unifying against them. In Iran, we see religious cleavages prompting quotas and reserved seats for minorities in the majlis. Not every religion gets a seat in the majlis. It's not like, okay, this many seats to non-Muslims. No, it's this many seats are Christian, this many seats are Jewish, and that sort of thing. And that's enhanced political legitimacy for these non-Muslim minorities. In Nigeria, we see these cleavages reinforcing each other and undermining legitimacy of the state because wealth and resources are typically found more in the south, and they're unequally distributed between the Muslim north and the Christian south. In the UK, we see greater regional autonomy has grown support for even greater independence. They're like, okay, we got a legislator. Can we just be our own country now? In China, the ethnic cleavages between the Uyghurs and the Han ethnic majority have prompted very strong and violent repressive measures by the government. And this strongly undermines the state legitimacy, not just through the Uyghur people, but also through Han Chinese that know what's going on. The Chinese officials have been putting Uyghur people in concentration camps to try to, quote-unquote, re-educate them and get them to support China, which is not something they should be doing. In Russia, class cleavages undermine legitimacy because the average person perceives oligarchs' political and economic power as a result of widespread corruption within the government. And there very well would be a ton of corruption within the oligarchs. In Mexico, ethnic cleavages between the indigenous minority groups, typically found in the South, and the majority have undermined legitimacy since the state provides an unequal public goods and services to indigenous people. And this stimulated the Zapatista uprising. Now, what does this mean, unequal distribution? Well, they're not going to give the same amount of goods and services to the North and to the South because the North needs it more. The North has more people. The North has more cities. The South is more spread out. They're going to need different services. And the tax base is a lot smaller. So the North can fund these services way more than the South. But there's been certain policies, and like the Zapatista uprising was caused by Mexico joining NAFTA, that can promote economic growth and development and flourishment way more in the North and can impede it in the South. And of course, there are challenges from our cleavages, particularly those in our multinational states. And it encourages conflicting interests and competition among groups and political parties. There was an election in Nigeria, a federal election for the president a few years ago, and there were over 70 political parties on the ballot. There could be a perceived lack of government authority and legitimacy, like we just talked about. There could be pressure for autonomy or seceding from the country, intergroup conflict, terrorism like Boko Haram in Nigeria, as well as civil war if it comes down to that. We can also see the encroachment of neighboring states that sense a government weakness and vulnerability. They might want to take it over or respond back with violence to try to influence what's happening within the country.
Thanks so much for watching. Please like and subscribe. It's free, which means it costs $0, and it really does help me out. Leave a comment down below with any questions. I'll be happy to answer them. There's some links down below in the description with practice tests, key terms, guided notes, all that fun stuff. Head on over to the next AP Comparative video on some really cool political stuff.